All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel, and it's time for another biblical decode, Bible decode. In this case, the book of Luke, and we are looking at the work of Michael Maniscalco, and his pretty new book came out in late 2024 called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians, as you may know, is the dynasty of Caesars in the late 1st century. Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian, the three Roman emperors of the Flavians. And that's from 69 to 96 AD. And a lot of scholarship that's coming out here in the 21st century, but sporadic throughout the 20th and 19th centuries, has to do with the Roman origins hypothesis of Christianity, in particular the New Testament. And I guess this is kind of culminating with Joseph Atwill's book called Caesar's Messiah from 2005, where he breaks it down and shows nearly conclusively that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars, for the purposes of really neutralizing or even pruning or domesticating or taming the Jews. And the Jews had been a big pain for the Romans ever since they came under their orbit in 63 BC. And countless amounts of insurrections, uprisings, revolutions, and insurrections later, including a few wars, the Romans decided to try to tame the Jews through writing the New Testament. And so this is a form of psychological warfare, propaganda, and a psychological operation done by the Romans, a limited hangout, so to speak, because certainly there's plenty of useful material in the New Testament. A lot of Stoic philosophy from people like Seneca, and Neoplatonism, and a lot of even mythology from Egyptians and Greeks and Babylonians and all over the place. And it's all kind of woven in there, but the main purpose of the New Testament was to mellow out the Jews. The Jews were waiting for a Messiah at this point. Now, we're talking about the late 1st century now. 66 to 73 AD was this final, not final, but kind of climactic war between the Jews and the Romans, called the War of the Jews, which is the title of Josephus's book, 7 volumes, War of the Jews, or Jewish War. And the Romans recognized that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. But the Jews, and because it had been prophesied in the Old Testament, but the Jews were waiting for a military Messiah. They were waiting for somebody to come on and help them overthrow, in this case, the Romans. Before that, the Seleucids, and before that, the Babylonians. But in this case, to overthrow the Romans and to free Palestine, free Judea from the yoke of the oppressor. And so the Romans instead decided to come up with a Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar, turning the other cheek on oppression, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack, and telling the Romans that they know not what they do, so forgive them, and or telling God they know not what they do, so they forgive them, and seeing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all Judea, and telling the Jews that all of the blood shed all the way from Abel to Zachary, who wasn't even part of the New Testament, will come down on their head for what they did to him. So Jesus is a purely pro-Roman, anti-Jewish character. And that's because he was written by the Romans. And the Romans obviously had the motive. They had the means. They had, this giant empire with all of the resources in the world. They had the means in terms of the educational means. They were amongst the only literate people that were around. There were a few, other literate people, but they had, and in Palestine, the literacy rate was even lower. And those who did write probably didn't write in Greek, which is what the New Testament is written in. But the Romans, Greek was very, very common. And although the elites like to use Latin, but they all knew Roman. All knew Greek. So the Romans also had a monopoly on publishing, on censorship. Nothing was going to get published in the Roman Empire if the Roman Caesars didn't approve of it first. And they had a monopoly on publishing. They are the only group of people that had a fleet of slave scribes to write these documents down over and over and over and over and over again. These people lived their lives as, human printing presses, human copy machines. And so they didn't have anything like that in Palestine. And the Romans were the only people that had a mail service to distribute the published works. Nothing like that occurred, in spite of the fact that Paul, dictates all of these letters, to the various churches. There's nobody to deliver those letters unless he gets the approval of the Romans. So, what the Romans did is they kind of manufactured this character named Josephus. And Josephus is known by Christians as one of the great historians of all time, and he's known as a corroborating witness to the existence of Jesus, which is quite far from the truth, because he was no type of witness. Even in the best scenario, he was writing, his earliest works are War of the Jews from the mid-70s, at the early 70s AD. That's a good 40 years after the existence of Jesus. And Josephus was born in 37 AD, which is at least 4 years after the death of Jesus. And so he was not an eyewitness, just about the same as Paul was not. Paul was not an eyewitness either. And so they created this character named Josephus. He eventually wrote up a autobiography, which states that he was during this war, he was a Jew who was fighting as one of the commanders in the Jewish army. But eventually he was captured by Vespasian, who at the time was the military commander for the Romans. And when he was captured, he had an epiphany, and he said to himself that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans. And he gave Vespasian the star prophecy, saying that, I see that one day you will become emperor. And one day Vespasian did become emperor. And he, on his way to, so he dropped the military commander gig, gave that over to his son Titus, and he went straight to Rome. Well, not straight to Rome, because first he went to get Josephus and pardon him and bring him along with him to Rome to be one of the court historians. And then he also adopted Vespasian into his family. That's why he's known as Flavius Josephus. He's a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. He gave Vespasian a townhouse at the Caesar's palace. And that's where Josephus lived out his days. It seems like he was at least there for 20 or 25 years. And what Josephus did is he wrote this 7-volume War of the Jews, but at the same time, he wrote the Gospels. And he backdated the Gospels by 40 years. And that sets up this parody or parallel type situation where the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled by Titus, the general, the Jewish general, soon to become emperor in Jewish war. So, for example, Jesus says when he meets Simon and Andrew on the fishing boat and gets them to basically ditch their father and go with him, and he says, "Come with me, I will make you fishers of men." And then fast forward to the exact same location, Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee. There's a military battle with Titus and the Jews, and it's on the water, and I think one of the ships of the Jews capsizes or something, tips over, something happens. It ends up with an abundance of Jews in the water. And Titus directs his men, to basically start harpooning them. When their heads come up above the water, harpoon them and kind of reel them in. So Titus literally tells his men to become fishers of men. So that's the kind of dark humor that the Romans use throughout these different parodies. There are so many of them that make your head spin. And that's what, now also, the place where the prophecy is made is the exact same place where the prophecy is fulfilled by Titus. The date that the prophecy is made is 40 years to the day of when Titus fulfills the prophecy. But that's just one of several of types of parodies that are going on here. What Michael Menescott does in this book, Christianity's Origins, is he takes just the book of Luke and then all of the parallels from the book of Luke and the work of Josephus. He puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis, chapter 1 at the bottom, chapter 24 at the top. He puts War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, paragraph 1 at the left-hand side, paragraph 694 at the right-hand side. And whenever he finds a parallel, he puts a point there, plots a point or a star there. And 250 parallels later. So he found over 250 parallels in just the book of Luke. And he plotted all the points, and it makes basically 5 perfect Latin letters. APTVS, or possibly TUS. And I believe that stands for Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus, but definitely the T and the V are Titus and Vespasian. The others, Arius Piso was kind of like the shadow emperor, who a few different scholars have independently determined he was the primary author of the Gospels. So that's also a possibility. But anyway, the main point is that not only did the Romans write the New Testament, but they actually signed their name to it, or at least put their initials on it. Okay, now the set of parallels that he's going through right now have to do with the Passover ritual. So these are not actually parallels; they're more like triangulated, because he's bringing in the Exodus chapter 12, which delineates the steps that you have to take to do a proper Passover sacrifice ritual. And then he parallels those, showing that Jesus is the sacrificial lamb, and that also it's tied into the ongoing events of Jewish war. In particular, paragraph 618, where a character named Mary is in Jerusalem under siege, and there's a major famine going on in Jerusalem because the Romans won't let any food in, and she decides to kill her infant son, the son of Mary, to kill him and roast him and eat him. But she only eats half, and she keeps the other half and offers it to people that invade her space at some point, and they're disgusted by it. And there's no eyewitness to any of this, so this is not a history. Josephus is not a historian. This is a parody. It's mean-spirited. It's intended to mock anybody who believes it, and that goes true for people who are reading it today. The Romans, the people that wrote this, are amongst the worst people that have ever lived on the planet ever. The first century Roman Caesars, the most perverted, debauched, excessive, and just degenerate group of people that have ever lived. That's who wrote the New Testament. Okay, let's look at Exodus 12, chapter 9. The requirement is to cook it with fire. For the vast majority of commoners, this means a spit roast, a stick driven lengthways through the body. Now we go to Luke chapter 23, verse 36. And they're the same kind of verses are also in Matthew 27:48, John 19:28, Mark 15:36. On the cross, Jesus cried out that he was thirsty. So a jar was placed full of vinegar, and someone ran and filled a sponge with vinegar. And he put it on a reed, a hyssop stalk, and they held it up for Jesus to drink, and they put it to Jesus' mouth. But Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now we're looking at Jewish War, paragraph 577. That's book 5, chapter 10, paragraph 3. During the famine in Jerusalem, whilst under siege by Titus, the robbers, meaning the Jewish zealots, I believe, invented terrible methods of torment to discover food, including to stop up the passages of the privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundaments. And a man was forced to bear what it is terrible even to hear, to make him confess that he had but one loaf of bread. Okay, well, let's see what he has to say about that. Whilst Exodus doesn't say it, it must be a spit roast. Every first century Jew would know that this is the way the lamb would be cooked in most households. So the reference to Jesus letting out a cry when presented with a butt stick, which is, the butt stick is the thing that is, now he says, so a jar was placed full of vinegar and someone ran and filled a sponge with vinegar. And then in parentheses, he says, therefore, as many Christian scholars have noted, this is a xylospongium. So it's not like a sponge that we're used to. He says it's a xylospongium, which is a communal stick for scrubbing people's butts. So, yeah. Okay, so for Jesus letting out a cry when presented with a butt stick, and the reference in Jewish War to men having sharp stakes driven up through their butts is quite transparent. So basically, in order to make heads or tails of that, no pun intended, you have to know that thing about the xylospongium, which apparently anyone who was reading in the first century probably would have known, but probably no one who's reading now would have really known. So again, you know, this was written, this was a game for the Romans. They loved these puns, word plays, alias names, codes and riddles. This was amusement to them. And certainly a lot of people sitting at the court of the Caesars would have gotten good humor from all of this. Okay, in addition to the main idea, which is to neutralize the Jews, and also to, it's a pro-slavery, it's also pro-slavery, maintenance of slavery or the status quo, where, Paul basically, demands that his people, his slaves follow orders and so on. And Jesus says to the slave that his faith is greater than all Judea. Okay, to understand this last parallel, it is necessary to know of first century bathroom habits. Since the intended audience was first century commoners, this knowledge could be assumed present, but to us it is not trivial. So he said in that sentence what it took me like 3 minutes to say, but the same point. A sponge on a stick, known as a xylospongium, would be left out for communal use, for people to scrub their butts with, and this would be left in a jar, often containing vinegar. In the absence of toilet paper, this was considered hygienic enough. The clear hint toward a xylospongium has previously been noted by Christian scholars, who assumed the Romans were humiliating Jesus by inviting him to drink from a communal butt scrubber sponge. It's pretty brutal. Okay, then I think I'm having a lot of trouble with my internet here. We'll see if I can, I need to turn the page I have this online here, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it up. I have a copy of the book here, but it's written in such tiny fonts that it's really hard to see. So I'm going to have to kind of put my head down and read the rest of it then, because I'm not able to pull it up here. But okay. It seems odd to find crude toilet humor in religious scripture. However, recall that the purpose of this second set of parallels was to leave proof that Titus's government invented Jesus, with the end goal being to turn the hooked Titus Jesus worshippers away from belief in Jesus and leave them as pure emperor worshippers. With this in mind, repulsive content makes sense, as it would make the reader feel embarrassed to have believed Jesus was anything other than merely a parable of Titus. So Menescott's theory, which, you know, is possibly correct, but I think it's kind of distracting from the main purpose, the main point. And to me, the main point is that the Romans wrote the Gospels, and the proof is in the 250 parallels in just the book of Luke that he goes through one by one, and that when plotting those parallels on a graph, it creates 5 Latin letters that is the signature of the Romans. But he's got this side argument that says this is a Flavian secrecy cult. So it's kind of like the Masons or any type of initiatory cult where there's different levels. And the first level is seeing Jesus as a hero, and then eventually you see Jesus as the Messiah. But then you recognize that the prophecies that Jesus makes really makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. And so the next level is to recognize that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. But then the final level is you recognize that Jesus is fiction and that Titus is the only God. And he calls that pure emperor worship. So that's kind of what he's talking about there. Having described the parallels involved in this parody of Exodus, I again plot their locations. You can check them by simply looking at the paragraph and chapter references, which I give for every example, and you can check my excerpts by reviewing the full text of the documents, which is trivial to find on various independent websites. Recommending the Loeb translation or the Whiston translation of Josephus and PDF, and then the Greek interlinear text for your New Testament. All the previous parallels involved either Luke parodying Jewish war or vice versa. However, these parallels were fundamentally different, with both stories evoking each required act of Exodus 12. So accordingly, I will color them differently in red. So he's creating his graph, and most of this is in the S, the vertical part of the S. And you can see the whole graph on the thumbnail for this video. That's the whole thing totaled up. I guess he has like 3 colors. So blue when Josephus is parodying the New Testament, black when the New Testament is parodying Josephus, and red when they both are parodying Exodus 12. I think there might be another color that he'll present later too. To ensure nobody could argue that actually Luke and Jewish war are merely both mirroring Exodus 12, Jewish war also mentions details only found in Luke, such as the sacrifice of a human and his mother being Mary. These are below. Okay, so I believe when we tune in tomorrow, we will kind of go over kind of a summary of all of these Passover-related parallels that stem from Exodus 12, and a lot of them are from Josephus 6:18, which is a very important paragraph there where Mary sacrifices her son and then roasts him and eats him, and eats only half, leaves the other half, and offers it to the robbers who come to steal from her. And she says that she leaves the good portion, which is exactly the same phrase used by Jesus in Luke. I think it's about Luke 14, might be a little bit later than that, where Lazarus, he so-called resurrected Lazarus and brought Lazarus home for a supper. And Martha is angry at Jesus because Mary is washing Jesus's feet when she should be in the kitchen helping her prepare the meal. And Jesus says, Mary has chosen the good portion. So he probably is going to delve into that as well. Atwill goes into that part too. So there's all kinds of parallels, and there are probably many more parallels that we don't know about because we don't know the insider jokes. Now, fortunately, the scholars here were lucky enough to figure out, or not lucky enough, but they figured out that the vinegar on a sponge is really a butt stick. And that was an attempt to humiliate Jesus, but it's also a spit roast, or like an analogy or a parody on a spit roast. And that the same theme is also brought up in Josephus. So all three of them have the theme of, shoving a stick up you lengthwise. So anyway, that to me is kind of devastating. It seems pretty obvious that was the message that was intended. All right, so have a good day, and like, share, subscribe. We'll see you tomorrow.